I just wanted to talk about management, particularly management of vulnerable people, and the importance for those people who are in those roles to have strong relationship skills and emotional maturity. And what I mean by that is the ability to role reverse with the people that they have been charged with the responsibility for. So, in the case of a psychiatrist, that's to be able to consider what it is like to be forced to take medication. And for a psychologist, it might be what it's like uh, to be a man who is um, uh, in an environment where there are not many women, where men are vulnerable to perceive certain behaviours or actions or remarks as interest in them that is beyond a therapeutic relationship, and therefore therapists, psychologists, registered clinical psychologists need to be able to talk about these issues with men without resorting to suddenly withdrawing all attention from men. Um, when we're talking about people that manage corrections facilities, they need to be able to understand what it might be like to sit in a cell for 18 to 24 hours a day with an open toilet beside you, and to be handed meals in a brown paper bag with no cutlery, and to be expected to sleep in beds that are dirty, have scabies and bed bugs, that are pillows that are not of adequate support and are dirty, mattresses that are lumpy and dirty, and bedding that is frankly way too thin for winter conditions. And I think anyone who has that ability to imagine what that must be like is not going to condone the kind of facilities that our high risk men are placed in. And these aren't just men that have been found guilty, these are also men who are on remand for long periods of time because the court system is so clogged up. And a CEO who can't see the pressure that this places not only on the prisoners but on the staff that have to deal with their complaints, and such that prior to that riot, prisoners' complaints were just being ignored. They would press their bell and the officers would hang up on them. There was a general culture of make a complaint but know that it doesn't go anywhere. And so prior to the riot, the men had rung News Hub and asked for a negotiation to talk about what needed to change in their living conditions. And News Hub rang the head office of corrections and were refused. And so an hour after that, the men began the riot. Shortly after that, they had started fires in the area that they took over, And although the staff on the ground were concerned about men in their cells crying because they feared they were going to be burnt to death and just left there, um, and then more officers talked about the toxic smoke and the asbestos in the building that was being burning. The order didn't come down from head office for 6.5 hours after that toxic smoke and those fires were lit. So you've got 200 men sitting in cells, staff that are in charge of them also sitting there exposed to poisonous gases, and head office refusing to give the order to evacuate. It, it just is beyond comprehension that someone could do that. And when the evacuation was ordered at 10:30 at night, the report talks about two men being found semi-conscious, one with his head down the toilet and one under his bunk, and having to be carried out. You know, just based on the way that the news media have been discouraged from reporting that, suggests that actually there may well have been deaths which have been hushed up. Certainly, that's what the officers were afraid was happening. And we know that there has been a death in transitional housing, but there's no references anywhere about that, at least on the media that I'm allowed access to. So these are basic humanity, acting with humanity as a manager, and the management of corrections who were responsible for that debacle have showed no accountability. The man who had to front the journalists was not employed in that role at the time of this riot. The man who was in his role at that time and prior to that, the CEO, Jeremy Lightfoot, is nowhere to be seen. There's no responsibility taken for actually what has changed in your culture around how you care about not only the prisoners in your care but the staff in your care. And to me, this is a very good example of why people are complaining, is because in places like this transitional housing, people's rights, basic human rights for privacy, for safety, for peace, peacefulness, not being re-traumatized, are routinely ignored. And when you complain, the complaint isn't properly investigated. Um, the certainly the timeframes aren't adhered to, and people avoid responsibility. And we're just giving more and more money to these organisations who are doing more and more damage to vulnerable people. The mental health department is a classic example of a government department that is employing a psychiatrist who continued to have an intimate relationship with a convicted murderer who used false prescriptions to poison his wife, and for some reason wasn't charged as part of that whole investigation. It, and even the chief executive at the time saw no problem in in employing Brewer, the guy convicted of murdering, even though he had been stood down or he was under supervision because of a pethidine addiction. How on earth can anyone think that is an acceptable um, proposition? How on earth wasn't he investigated properly before he took up the job? These are people wielding power to change people's brains, for goodness sake. And many of them have some addictive personalities themselves, and certainly what looks like some mental health issues in that would fall into antisocial. I I feel very anxious about um, the state of this industry and how it has been allowed to get to this point. It really concerns me, and I think one of the reasons it's been allowed to get to this point is because of the control that the legal profession, much of whom are not New Zealand born lawyers, who bring a different ethics to the whole question of how we treat people who are legislated to be under the control of others.